And we're alive. Excellent.
Hi, we're Naked Security back on Facebook Live. I'm Anna, this is Doug.
Hello, folks.
As always, please leave your comments or ask questions. We'll answer them as we go along, but if you're watching this later, ask anyway, because we can answer them in text. Doug, over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about iPhone holes and Android malware.
Yes, they both bubble to the top suddenly, like huge stories and very general.
Shall we panic?
Not at all. I mean, we're looking behind the camera is the Sophos Lake, which surrounds our building, and you might be forgiven if you've seen some of the stories we've written on Naked Security recently about mobile phone insecurity. Maybe it's time we fling our phones in the lake and go back to good old rotary dial or pen and paper. I think the problem is that the stories have been very, very general. Sometimes you get a mobile phone story and it's all about, there's this particular app snoops on you, or that particular app does this, that, or the other.
Yep.
So you go and look on your phone, I haven't got that app, I'm golden.
Yep.
But in this case, the story about Android was a researcher at Black Hat, a Google researcher, had uncovered that there were cases of pre-installed Android apps. In one case, 21 million instances of this malware. 7 million of them were not downloaded by users. They were pre-installed on phones bought legitimately from a vendor.
Okay.
So that's much more general than what do you do in a case like that? And the problem with the iPhone recently, another Google researcher, also at the Black Hat conference, did a paper studying what was the risk, what bugs might exist on your iPhone, in iOS, that a crook could trigger by just because you had your phone on. For example, they could send you a booby-trapped message, and even without you reading it and clicking it and pressing a link or going, yes, I want you as a friend or whatever, just by your phone processing the message, what if they could do something bad? And they did find, I think, up to 8 different bugs. Fortunately, Apple patched them. So those stories, they're much more overarching about sort of mobile insecurity and mobile fear than the general ones we write. And they did cause a little bit of a stir because it sounded like, well, iPhone's full of holes and Android's full of pre-installed malware, so there's no choice, we're all doomed. But that's not the case, because there are a few simple precautions you can take that will mean that you can enjoy your phone and even use it to improve your security. For example, two-factor authentication. Great example of how your phone can actually help you improve security rather than reduce it.
Okay. And so with the Android, you said about the pre-installed app, that's called bloatware, is it?
Yeah, it seems that particularly with lesser-known vendors who want to try and be, as Matt Boddy liked to put it. In fact, there's a great section in the latest Naked Security podcast about these issues where we go into detail. But as Matt Boddy puts it, he said, everyone who's coming up with a new Android device, it's a very competitive market, there are thin margins, everyone wants to be the greatest new device. And unfortunately, what some vendors like to do is they figure, well, we can't decide which is the killer app. So we'll preload the app with loads and loads of stuff. In fact, apparently there are even some phones, according to the Google researcher, that had between 1 and 400 pre-installed apps. So that's why you get the name bloatware. And the problem with bloatware, A, it takes up a lot of space on your phone. B, it comes from a zillion different sources, so who knows what they're doing about security. C, that bloatware often includes libraries or add-on stuff, maybe for advertising or tracking and stuff like that, that's meant to provide a service to the vendor of the phone, but maybe the person they got that service from is kind of milking a little bit of extra data. And D, of course, bloatware just takes up space, and people want to get rid of it, but they can't because it's kind of part of the phone.
Right. But Google has said they've done quite a lot to fix the problem, have they?
Well, the mainstream pre-installed malware they've found, of course, they've got rid of that, and I guess they go back to these OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, the vendors of the phones, and say to them, well, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other. They have a certification program, so if you buy a phone that's certified, then there are a few more checks. Of course, there are people in some markets, so it depends on where in the world you are, who actually seek out phones that are a little bit cheaper, and a little bit freer and more open, precisely so they can go and do what they want with them. And of course, when they do that, they're perhaps inadvertently adopting this risk that the thing hasn't been certified by Google, that it doesn't get the same kind of oversight that it might otherwise do. So bloatware is a big problem because, if you've got Android, you'll know that you can go into settings apps and you can list all your apps. And the ones that you've installed, say from Google Play or wherever you've got them from, there's a button that says uninstall.
Yeah.
But if it's bloatware, if it's pre-installed software, usually you only get a button that says disable.
Yeah.
So you can turn the app off temporarily, maybe for an hour or so, or until you restart your phone. But there's no uninstall because it's kind of baked into the phone and the vendor doesn't want you to remove it. And that's the problem, is that if you buy a phone that has too much stuff on it, you kind of can't get rid of it later.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes Android users worried. How do they deal with the fact that there's this stuff that they didn't ask for, that they don't want, and if it's got a bug, who's going to fix it if they can't do it themselves? And that's a genuine concern.
Yeah. We've had hello from Therese from Dublin.
Hello, Therese from Dublin. Is it Therese or Teresa?
I would say Therese. It's an E at the end.
Okay.
We don't know. Let us know how you pronounce it, and say hello, everybody else. So should we be jailbreaking our phones or rooting them? Give us better control.
Yes, that's a question that we frequently get asked whenever we write about mobile insecurity. Now, the terms that you'll hear are jailbreaking, which generally is used to refer to iPhones, and that's because, compared to Android, Apple has much greater control over the ecosystem. They only have a few phone models. Everyone's on the same version of the operating system, and the idea is you can only go to the App Store. There's no option to say, let me install third-party apps.
Right.
So the idea is it's called jailbreaking there. You basically get administrator powers and you escape from Apple's strictures. And it's called jailbreaking because Apple doesn't want you to do it, and they have all these controls. You're not supposed to be able to do it. Yeah. But when you do, well, then you can go in and it's great for research and you can learn more and you can install weird apps. The problem is that the only way to jailbreak your phone generally is what a lot of jailbreakers do is they deliberately stick on old versions of iOS for as long as they can until someone finds a bug that they can exploit to go in and get control. Yeah. So it's kind of like you have to reduce security with the hope of increasing it. Yeah. On Android, it's known as rooting, and that's because root is the name for Unix, or Linux is the name for the admin account. Yeah. And what you're doing is apps aren't supposed to have system control, only the system is. Yeah. So if you root your phone, what you do is you're tricking into giving you power so you can be the admin and you can do things that Google doesn't want you to. Okay. So you can make your phone more secure that way, but if you don't know what you're doing, it's easy to have a giant blunder. Yeah. And then you're in trouble.
Sorry, someone's noticed our little picture.
I'm saying nothing. I just want it known that it may or may not be me in the photo.
You have to check out our animations on Twitter and Facebook if you want to know more, if you haven't already seen them.
So now it's come up, I don't have to pretend it's not there.
No.
So can I throw horns at the audience?
You can pretend you're in Kiss.
Yeah.
Tor Eric has said, hello from Norway.
Hi.
And Thomas Faulkner, don't know if you know him, he said, Dark.
Thomas!
He said,
yo!
He said, I agree with rooting phones, as we should be able to do what we want with our phones. On iPhone, you can sideload applications from websites, such as Tweetbox. Are we supposed to say that?
There is a way that you can write your own apps or install business apps on an iPhone. Yeah. There are some limitations behind that, and Apple is trying to get a little bit more strict about that because they're considering this wide abuse. Now, the problem is for the average person, if you root your phone, typically what happens, you end up with a few apps on your phone that have powers that maybe aren't quite what they were designed for. Yeah. Because the idea on both iOS and Android is very different from on your laptop, you log in, you put in your username and your password, that's your user account. And when, say you're running Word and PowerPoint, they're both running as you, and therefore you can share files between them. On a phone, generally each app runs as a different user. Right, okay. And that's quite good because it means that apps can't accidentally read each other's data, given that you're going to get apps from lots of different sources and you don't want them talking to each other. Yeah. If you have a rooted phone, you do run a risk, if you don't know what you're doing, that you end up with an app that's grabbed, that you've given authority to, that you don't realize, that suddenly, so you might have an app that's a calculator or a camera app or an image filter, and suddenly it can actually not only fiddle with system settings, it can go and read data from other apps, which is a security precaution that's not supposed to happen on your phone. But I agree with the idea that if you want to do it, you should be able to, because it is your device. If you bought it with your own after-tax earnings, why shouldn't you do what you like? Apple says no. even at the end of life, even with your iPhone when they won't support it anymore,
Right.
you can't basically rip off iOS and put on something of your choice. If you have an Android phone, you do have more choice. When Google won't support you anymore, or if you decide that you don't want the thing that came with it,
Yep.
a lot of Android phones can be unlocked, either for free or for a small fee. And when you've done that, then you can actually pretty much install what you like.
Yep.
The problem is, if you're worried about trusting Google and Google Play Store, because that's where you've lived, if you decide to go for alternative firmware, a different version of Android, I've got an Android phone here. I'm running, I'll just show everybody, I'm running a thing called Lineage OS. Now, it doesn't officially support this phone, so that's an unofficial build of a kind of unofficial operating system done by the open source community. If you delve into that world, you'll find there are all sorts of firmware ROMs you can download for your Android phone, stripped down, this left out, that left out, no bloatware, but they're kind of made by you don't know who from whatever country, you just can't say. So the problem with routing and using an alternative firmware on an Android phone is you still have to go through that, well, how do I decide whether I trust the guys? But it is a way to repurpose an older Android phone. You can frequently make use of it. For example, the Samsung I don't think supports this phone. It's a Galaxy S3. It was very cool back in the day, but it's really old school. But I'm running Android 9.
Yeah.
The only disadvantage, because it's an unofficial build, if I put that very close, you'll see the last updates available in this particular firmware come from July. So I haven't I'm not able to get the August updates yet.
Right. Okay.
So again, I'm like 1 month behind, unless I want to go and do a whole load of hacking work myself and build my own Android and install it. So routing a phone, it's not for the faint-hearted, but it can be a great way of building yourself an Android that has a load of the stuff that's normally on your phone left out. But don't just do it because you think it will inherently be more secure. It's fun. You can learn a lot about Android, but if you're doing your business or your personal email on there, bear in mind that if you get things wrong, you could be in a worse situation.
Yeah. So for the non-sort of technical users of phones, most people, what are your top tips for staying safe?
I think the biggest one is that everyone's worried about what about surveillance? What if someone's listening to my phone? What if the bloatware's got this ad tracking thing in it? What if iPhones have got these vulnerabilities?
Because this is all largely out of people's control, isn't it?
It is. So the deal is, I think that for most people, at least in the Western world, things are a little bit different in the Asian marketplace, where there's a people can't necessarily get apps in their native language, and there are a lot of cheap phones available. For example, in China, the market's quite flooded with lots of different types of budget phones, and people love to go off market and experiment. It's a little bit different in the West, and particularly the Anglophone world, where if you stick to the Apple App Store, which you have to, or Google Play, which you don't, but most people do, you can pretty much get whatever you need.
Yeah.
So I think for the average person, the biggest risk you're going to have is if you don't get updates that are available, then you're definitely leaving yourself at risk. So this big iOS has these vulnerabilities, booby-trap message story. Right. If you've patched, you're pretty much immune to those already, because Google told Apple fixed them, and only then did they announce.
So how do people make sure?
Okay, so on iPhone, it's pretty easy. I'm going to have to go off camera here so that nobody sees what my passcode is. Not like Kanye West. I hope that didn't show up. So I've gone into the settings menu on your iPhone. You see at the top there's an option that says General. And if you go into General, then the second option is a thing called Software Update. Now, even if you've got automatic updating on, which most people do on an iPhone, then what you want to do is go in there regularly, and you'll see I actually turned automatic updates off for the purpose of this. You'll see that by going in there, it actually calls home, it checks my version against Apple's one, and says you've got 12.4, you are up to date. If I weren't up to date, it would say, hey, there's a newer version, do you want to get it now? And I can make an informed decision. So actually, that's not just for an iPhone, also for Windows, for Mac, for whatever you're using. Even if you've got automatic updating turned on, learn how to do it manually, and once in a while, go and check, because the last thing you want is to find that your automatic updates have broken, and you're sitting there going, oh, I'm ahead of the game, but actually you're 3 months behind. Now, on Android, it's a little different, and it kind of depends on the version. So, for example, on mine, I go to the settings, and I go into the option called System, I think it's gone a bit dark. Whoops, now I've gone to backup. So I go into the settings menu. That's on Lineage, Android 9, very similar. And in system, you will see, unfortunately here it's under advanced. The last option says there's an updater. And if I go into updater, then you get to that screen I showed before. And there's a refresh button which will go and forcibly check for updates right now and make sure I'm up to date. So it may vary on your Android phone, but there will be a way where even if you've got over-the-air automatic updating turned on, you can go and check whether you've missed anything.
Yep.
Now, one problem on Android, if you have an older device or if you have a sluggish vendor who doesn't care, you might say, yes, you're up to date and the most recent update was March 1975 or something crazy like that.
Yep.
As you saw on mine, because I'm using an unofficial Lineage OS, it says you're up to date. The last update was from July.
Yeah.
And I realize, okay, I'm a month behind. Am I happy with that?
Yeah.
So you may find with older Androids that you are up to date, but the last update date stamp is months or years ago. In that case, you're kind of stuck.
Yep.
Then you could consider routing your phone and putting on a more up-to-date firmware from an alternative source at your own risk.
Yep.
Or sadly, you may need to consider going and buying a different phone from a different vendor, one that which has a reputation for maybe supporting phones for longer and not letting you get way behind.
Yeah.
And Google's put a lot of pressure on its ecosystem so that vendors don't do this thing about, I'll update once a year, it's enough.
Yep.
And they've teased apart the operating system and the apps a bit more than they had before, so they can provide the operating system updates and expect everyone to apply those.
Yep.
Your apps might lag behind, but at least if there are holes in the operating system itself, you should be able to get patches.
Okay.
So that to me is the most important thing. That there's no point in worrying about whether you've got the wrong bloatware or the government's listening to your phone calls because they've got some secret implant in your phone if you're 6 months behind the crooks anyway. And the other thing that you absolutely need to do is make sure you have a decent lock code on your phone.
Like
it's
Kanye
really
West.
Like Kanye West. Actually, the Kanye West story, for those who don't remember it, we wrote it up on Naked Security. I think he went to meet President DJ Trump, and he said, Mr. President, I'll show you this. And he whips out his phone, and you see him typing in, what was it, 0000000 as his passcode. And everyone was laughing at him, saying, what a silly man, he's got 8 zeros or 6 zeros as his passcode. Actually, the real problem there is it didn't matter whether he could have had the most complicated, the best thought out random passcode in the world. He was filmed typing it in openly, and you could slow it down and see which buttons he pressed. So whatever his passcode was, that's a real problem. So pick a decent passcode. Apple now is a minimum of 6. If you can go a bit longer than that, see if you can. You'll get used to it. It's not that hard. You consider using for day-to-day, minute-by-minute stuff. If you've got an older iPhone, you can use the fingerprint or the face recognition, so you don't have to type in your passcode all the time. But when you do need to type in your passcode, like when you use your bank card, the cash machine, be aware of your surroundings. If there's a TV camera up there somewhere, if there's somebody behind you, then you are entitled to your privacy. Shield your phone when you're typing in that code. And of course, with the things like face recognition or fingerprint, you can reduce the number of occasions where you actually have to type it in. But the passcode is really important, especially if you're using your phone for two-factor authentication. Because if someone can just trivially unlock your phone, then they can just pick it up, and then they'll get the codes that they need to log in as you, and then you're kind of back to one-factor authentication. So the idea of the passcode is they are, on modern phones, they're hard to bypass because they're stored in a special secure part of the phone, a special chip. It's not just written to disk where any crook with a USB cable and knows what they're doing can easily figure it out. Both Google and Apple have put a lot of effort into making it really hard to recover passcodes from phones. As we know from the fact that the FBI keep telling us, we need access, we need to hack this phone. That may be bad when they're trying to investigate, say, terrorism or some very serious crime, but it's actually really, really good for the rest of us because it means it isn't trivial, and a crook can't just steal 50 phones and go and recover all the data off all of them. So use the technology that's built into your phone to keep it secure.
Great, thank you. We've had some comments.
Hopefully good ones.
Therese has confirmed it is an E. Teresa with an A. So it's because she's an E, it's Therese.
Okay, excellent.
Tor Eric has said there is a voice twin for Duck on the internet who works with animals. Can voice twins become accidental security risks now or in the future?
Yes, I don't know what a voice twin is. I mean, I presume...
Like a hand twin.
Oh, is it someone who just
hands,
looks...
You've got matching voices.
I suppose, well, I sort of, male, Anglo, speak some kind of fairly neutral received pronunciation. There must be plenty of people who do speak like me. But I haven't met my voice twin, and I don't work with animals. I mean, not professionally.
Absolutely not. Okay, and
so I'm dying to know who it is now.
Yeah,
Maybe he can let me know privately,
link?
and I can go and listen in.
Tor, he also said, I've got a laptop with 2 Windows updates from years ago that always fail to install. Other updates succeed, but 2 have been failing for years.
Yes, that's a tricky one. Like, what do you do about the things that you can't get and don't get? Do you start again by reinstalling Windows afresh, which was the old way? You get in such a mess with all the DLLs and apps you had installed that people would habitually wipe their computer and reinstall. That's much harder and more time-consuming these days. I guess the answer to that question is if you have a device and it is up to date, but it says, except I can't get this one and that one, then at least with Microsoft, there'll be a specific identifier. Go and look what that vulnerability is and see, and you have to make an assessment for yourself whether the risk is so severe that you want to wipe your laptop and do a fresh install, which hopefully if you're using a more recent release of the operating system will mean that you're closer to the beginning. That is an answer. For example, if you download the installer ISO for Microsoft Windows these days, say for Windows 10. In the old days, when you got Windows XP, you had the CD and you installed it, and over the years, when you installed it, you were further and further and further and further behind. Now, every time you download the installer, because obviously something for research you do frequently for building virtual machines, when you download the installer, basically it gets rebuilt every month, so it pretty much brings you up to date. So if you do a fresh install from the start, ignoring the past, then you kind of come in at a cleaner position. So you typically have to do one update rather than going through months and months and months and months. That might be a solution. But if something's broken and it's inside the updating system, it's hard to advise how you fix that. Short of sharpening a stick and poking it a bit and seeing what happens.
It's probably not a good idea.
No.
Any last tips?
Basically, I would say, because a lot of people use their phones for social networking and they use them at work and at home, and they talk about work at home and home at work, and maybe they also use their phones while they're out and about, and sometimes they might have had a couple of drinks, so they might be in a different frame of mind. Basically, be aware before you share. There's no point in worrying about what crooks might steal from your phone if you're willingly giving out too much already. And bear in mind that any crook who's got you in their sights knows to go and do online searches to find out about you, as you and I have spoken before about with romance scams. Again, latest podcast, you went into that in some detail, where people go, how on earth did the crook know all this about me? And you're going, because you went on a dating site and you told the world. And they just came in and they knew all that stuff. They didn't have to hack you. They just figured it out.
Cool, thank you, Jack.
It's a pleasure.
Keep your comments and questions coming, we'll answer them, and we will see you next time.
I got the sniggers now.
Bye.
Cheers, guys.